Hi, I'm Craig Smith, a former New York Times correspondent and host of the podcast Eye on AI. I'm also a special government employee at the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence, and in this role I'm serving as the host for NSCAI's podcast series on the Commission's work. At the beginning of March this year, the Commission issued its final report to the President and Congress outlining its recommended strategy for winning in the artificial intelligence era. This week, I talked to NSCAI staff Paul Leka and Christie about forming an international emerging technology coalition to strengthen and coordinate the use of emerging technology for democratic ends. I hope you find the conversation as important as I did. If we could start by having Paul and Christie, each of you introduce yourself, and then we can talk about rallying allies and partners in the coming AI era.
Hi, my name is Paul Leka, and I lead the staff team that's focused on marshaling support of allies and partners and pursuing different international initiatives to try to further AI and support U.S. national security. And I'm joined here today with Christie.
Yes, thank you, Paul. So I'm Christie Lawrence, and I'm on staff, a director of research and analysis, and I've been working on the team focused on marshaling global AI cooperation.
The report sets out the sort of frightening world that we're looking into. Some of the challenges are the prospect of authoritarian consolidation in states that have access to digital tools that strengthen repressive rule, or the prospect of fragile democracies backsliding if they have access to those kinds of tools that undermine liberal values, and then the overall threat to the cohesion of democratic allies as an influential bloc of states. So I thought maybe we could start by you telling us how international partnerships can help and how the U.S. can encourage these partnerships.
Absolutely. The core belief underlying the work that we've been doing in the international space is the United States can't do everything on its own, that there is a great need out there for the United States to be working with like-minded nations, try to shape a favorable order around AI and emerging technologies more generally. And I think various recommendations, which are the result of a lot of very focused work of a number of the commissioners on the commission and close consultations across the U.S. government and also with foreign governments and international organizations, is there's really I would say, a positive message in addition to a message that might be more defense or security oriented. And it's that there is a lot that really brings these nations together, and working together, nations can foster the sorts of standards and norms that we think are critical in technology and try to counter some of the standards and norms out there that have been used for illiberal or anti-democratic means. And so the chapter and the associated blueprints for action lay out a fairly comprehensive strategy for the United States to pursue with allies and partners. We're going to be focusing here in this discussion on Chapter 15, but cooperation with allies and partners is a theme that actually appears elsewhere in the report in different contexts. And one of the overarching recommendations that we have in Chapter 15 is for the United States to work with close allies and partners to build something we call the Emerging Technology Coalition. And this is an idea that has appeared in a number of forms in different places. And I think what the Commission's work here does that differentiates it is that it's more detailed in a way. There's more guidance about exactly how you would go about doing that. And so the Commission lays out a number of critical areas where cooperation is really important. One of those I've mentioned before, which has to do with international standards and norms, and that actually involves a few different things. Part of that is agreeing on AI principles. And there are some documents out there already that reflect a broad agreement among a number of like-minded states, such as the AI principles issued by the OECD. But it's going a level beyond that and really operationalizing those principles. And what do we mean by that? We mean, how do you promote technology that is trustworthy, that is reliable, that is secure, that contains privacy-preserving features, and so on? Technology that is less likely to be used for illiberal purposes, say, and technology that can support individual rights and also the interests of national governments. Another area that we put a lot of emphasis on is collaborative research and development. And granted, there's a lot of international work that's being done in research and development, but there's a lot more that could be done, especially when it comes to artificial intelligence and other emerging technologies. Another topic is working with other nations to foster talent exchanges and really to improve the talent, not just in the United States, but also in other countries. And to bring talent to the United States is a piece of that, but also supporting talent development in allied nations, in our close partners. And I'm not going to go through all of the different areas, but one area that has received particular attention is collaborating with allies and partners to promote what we call digital development. And what that means is promoting the development of digital infrastructure in nations around the world, and also promoting technology that can support democratic values and also counter undemocratic uses of technology. And we see that as a particular area where nations can come together and do something collectively. That latter topic, digital development, is one that we're going to explore in more detail on a separate podcast.
I just want to add to the broader question about countering illiberal uses of AI and the need for greater partnership. The report does quite a good job of articulating all of the threats that AI will be posing not only to the United States, but to the world. With AI-enabled cyber and malign information operations, the potential for unintended escalation from AI-enabled and autonomous weapons, a changing battlefield, and attempts to undermine democracy and shared values. And it's very clear that the United States, as Paul already mentioned, really needs to leverage the asymmetric advantages from greater partnership with key allies and partners. It needs to be the United States and allies addressing these threats. And then the flip side is that although there are threats that need to be countered together, there's also a lot of benefits that AI can enable for the United States and humanity. AI can enable drug discoveries. It can enable longer-term quality of life. It can transform energy management. It can increase business efficiencies. And those benefits will really be multiplied if the United States and allies and partners work together to pool their resources, pool their talent, and really join forces in trying to benefit humanity with all of the positive elements that AI can provide.
Working together is critical to addressing the challenges the technology poses. And some of those are technological, some of those are geopolitical, some of those have to do with complex and contrary regulations in various countries. But there's also the promise of technology, and we don't want to lose sight of that. And this sort of technology has great promise for common global challenges around climate, around healthcare. The pandemic that we're all living through is a great example of an area where actually working together internationally can help. So we want to make sure that in proposing enhanced partnerships that we're looking at both sides of the coin, dealing with common challenges and also pursuing opportunities to benefit humanity.
And part of the challenge on the international stage is picking your partners for each area that you're addressing. China has a tremendous amount to offer in the area of AI for drug discovery or AI for addressing climate change. So it seems to me that's the challenge. How do you restrain China and its AI activities in areas that are considered a threat to democratic principles? And then how do you engage on areas that are clearly of global advantage? All of this stuff would be articulated in an international science and technology strategy from what I understand, of the recommendations that would be part of the national technology strategy drafted with leadership from the White House. Do I have that right? And then how do you engage allies in a national strategy? How do you form the Emerging Technology Coalition?
So let me begin with the strategy. The Commission's report, the Commission's recommendations in this Chapter 15, many of them are discrete recommendations fall under a much broader concept of international science and technology strategy. And so what the Commission has proposed here is that the White House convene all those agencies that have a piece of U.S. foreign policy. And it includes the main agencies, the big agencies that you would think of, like the Department of State and the U.S. Agency for International Development, but also a number of the other agencies that have very discrete but absolutely essential roles to play, like the Export-Import Bank and the Development Finance Corporation. And one of the findings of the research is that the United States has a lot of tools at its disposal, but doesn't always integrate them in a holistic manner towards similar ends. There are isolated examples of this where there's very good cross-agency coordination on programs that build on all the unique tools that each of these agencies have. But the idea behind the ISTS, the International Science and Technology Strategy, is that there would be a task force that brings together all these different agencies and comes up with a cohesive, integrated plan for trying to achieve certain ends around technology. And so within that strategy, the Commission has proposed 4 big pieces. And one of them is the Emerging Technology Coalition, as we started to discuss. Another is this digital development program, which we call the International Digital Development Initiative. A third is actually generating a cohesive national plan. And a fourth has to do with furthering international artificial intelligence research and development. Within the national plan, we have a few different pieces as well. And one of the aspects that we think needs more attention is a focus on international technical standards and really trying to promote U.S. interests, trying to coordinate interests and values with allies and partners, and trying to maintain the neutrality of international standard-setting organizations. We also have some recommendations in there about export controls in some other areas.
The plan that the Commission has recommended is quite ambitious, but we think it's not only viable, but extremely critical, particularly the Emerging Technology Coalition. And the Emerging Technology Coalition, the Commission recommends, would essentially be a coalition of like-minded nations. Members would draw upon a core group of technologically advanced democratic nations, reflecting a really broad geographic distribution. And these member nations would have demonstrated shared interest in advancing responsible AI, countering malign uses of emerging technology, and really ensuring those high standards of openness, trust, and privacy in digital infrastructure that Paul's mentioned. We don't make recommendations on exactly which countries that would be. We think that this task force and the Department of State and White House would be best positioned to identify which countries would be part of the founding members of the Emerging Technology Coalition. But we do think that this coalition would be additive to existing efforts. So one thing that we've heard is that there's been a question about what value would the Emerging Technology Coalition add. And the commissioners have been quite thoughtful about examining the existing international landscape, examining the full scope of different intergovernmental forums, standard-setting bodies, multilateral initiatives that touch upon artificial intelligence and emerging technologies. And they've made recommendations on how the United States, with like-minded allies and partners, can prioritize their engagement in over 20 different forums. But the Emerging Technology Coalition would still fill a critical gap that we don't think is being currently filled in the international landscape. And the commissioners have articulated 3 goals that this Emerging Technology Coalition would really fill. And the first would be promoting the design, development, and use of emerging technologies according to these democratic norms and values. The second would be coordinating policies and investments to counter the malign use of technologies by authoritarian regimes. And the third would be providing concrete competitive alternatives to counter the adoption of digital infrastructure in China. And the blueprint for action for Chapter 15 recommends that there would be a benefit for having an inaugural convening summit or conference for the Emerging Technology Coalition, where the coalition members would organize around 7 critical areas that Paul's already touched upon, some of them: developing standards, joint AI R&D, et cetera, and really come out of that inaugural meeting with a concrete agenda for projects, mechanisms, and different ways to really align across those 7 critical areas. And we also recommend that this Emerging Technology Coalition and inaugural meeting would include not just the governments, but also key non-state actors, private sector actors, international organizations that are also integral for achieving alignment and shared goals around these 7 critical areas.
Forming the coalition with a core of technologically advanced nations sets up within that coalition kind of a hierarchy where it's run by technologically advanced nations and other democratic countries or allies that sign on would take on a junior role. I'm wondering whether the Commission addressed that concern. And then the other is that forming a coalition to counter quote-unquote adversaries or strategic competitors is really focused on countering China. And China certainly is building its technological coalition through trade and other government policy. Is there a danger that we're going to pull into 2 blocks globally and that there will be countries, just as there were in the Cold War, that have to decide based on whatever advantage they see which block to join?
So Chapter 15 contains a blueprint and essentially a second blueprint within the blueprint, which lays out a whole bunch of really excellent guidance of what the Commission means by these different areas of cooperation and what are examples of successful collaboration in these areas. What are some areas where we might want to pursue collaboration with nations? And so when we're talking about research and development, there's a whole number of areas that are listed, specific projects, recommended steps to actually implement these things to make it real. When we talk about promoting innovation, there are discrete recommendations in several different areas around intellectual property, around the use of regulatory mechanisms like export controls and investment screening and so on. But what the recommendation for an emerging technology coalition doesn't do is get into the nitty-gritty of the governance. And that was intentional for a couple of reasons. One, because I think the Commission felt that was beyond the scope of its purview, and that is something that needs to be left to the officials at the Department of State, at the White House, and at other governments about exactly how they want to structure it. But the other is that this is less a proposal for kind of a world government around technology and more of a proposal for a vehicle to bring nations together to work on things, so that if it is determined that for a particular issue, it makes sense to have more of a structure where you have certain nations taking the lead and others are in participatory roles, then that's perfectly fine, but it's not something that the Commission is actually proposing. So I see this being realized through a gathering of nations, a regular gathering of nations every 12 or 18 months, say, to talk about these issues, with working groups in between, where the gathering is actually a way to facilitate connections. And it may be a different group of nations that are working on different issues. It may be that there is a subset of nations that wants to focus on semiconductor policy and manufacturing, or another group of nations that is really interested in how do we support the development and the dissemination of smart city technology that has privacy preserving mechanisms. And that may not be something that is of interest to everybody. So I think that there's enough flexibility in this proposal that it is not a proposal to create a new block of democratic nations, and rather it is a way to facilitate different groupings of nations to pursue different projects. And some of them would have more of a positive message, and others might be more protective or designed more to address discrete threats that come out. So one of the particular areas that the Commission has recommended there be a grouping of nations, and we would embed this within the broader Emerging Technology Coalition concept, is around malign information. And it is gathering nations that are interested and likely to share threat information and to work collectively on responding, which includes not only the actual responsive actions, but also the developing of technology that can enable responding to malign information that is disseminated, especially information that makes use of artificial intelligence.
One of the questions that I have about the coalition, I envisioned it as more of a bloc, but Paul, what you're describing is much more fluid and open. Would China be part of that coalition?
No, not in this coalition. This is not intended to be a coalition that would include states that have supported authoritarian uses of technology or are creating certain challenges to democratic nations. And I think the Commission has thought very deeply about working with China, and Chapter 9 of the report does actually call for promoting a U.S.-China comprehensive science and technology dialogue to discuss some of the challenges around technology and to try to manage any tensions that are related to those challenges, and also to explore the possibility that we can actually work together constructively, recognizing that there's already a lot of interaction between the United States and China and between U.S. and Chinese researchers, but is it possible to actually explore collaborative projects where we address common challenges?
The commissioners have been very intentional in articulating that the United States and China do need to be in dialogue, but it needs to be dialogue and associated cooperation that benefits the American people, is faithful to our allies, and really does press China to abide by international norms, which is informed by the reality that China has been promoting authoritarian uses of AI.
The recommendation the Commission makes about a U.S.-Chinese dialogue is a recommendation to the U.S. government. It's a recommendation for a bilateral dialogue that's focused on these issues. There have been a number of bilateral dialogues in the past, comprehensive dialogues, and it may very well be that there's a new U.S.-China comprehensive dialogue. Whether or not that's the case, it's the Commission's view that it's important for there to be a dialogue that addresses emerging technologies, to include AI, between the two nations. So the Commission is not making any recommendations to other nations about what their policy should be towards China, or whether they should engage in bilateral discussions with China. This is a recommendation that is separate from the coalition concept. The coalition concept is really meant as a vehicle to convene the United States with key allies and partners in close consultation with civil society and the private sector on a range of issues. And the Commission had opted not to identify who exactly they think should be in that coalition. But I think in the course of all of our work, there's a number of countries that are technologically advanced and they're aligned with the United States on many issues. And some of these won't be a surprise. Nations in the G7, for example, nations like India, which the Commission has specifically called for a much stronger relationship with on emerging technology, a comprehensive relationship. Australia, a number of other countries in Asia and elsewhere in Europe and other parts of the world.
Let me ask one more question about how the Technology Coalition operates, and then we can move on to the question of technical standards. You talk about applying the tools of foreign assistance, technical expertise and guidance, development finance, and also providing concrete competitive alternatives to counter the digital infrastructure made in China. How do you envision that working? Is that two countries within the coalition, or is that coordinating countries within the coalition to offer those kinds of assistance to non-aligned countries that might otherwise adopt Chinese technology or standards?
Yeah, just to be clear on the formality of the coalition, this wouldn't be a formal alliance, which would be governed by a treaty. So it is a looser grouping of nations than that, and that's why I hesitated at the use of the term bloc to describe it.
Within the Emerging Technology Coalition, the Commission recommends the launching of an international digital democracy initiative. And the goal for this would be to align the international assistance efforts. And we do view this Emerging Technology Coalition to be quite flexible. So the countries within the Emerging Technology Coalition that would be a part of launching this international digital democracy initiative, it might not be every country that's a part of this coalition, or it could be every country that's a part of this coalition. But we make the recommendation that as part of this sort of inaugural meeting and launching of the IDDI that the countries that would like to be a part of IDDI do a comprehensive review of the existing digital development landscape to identify best practices, to identify different mechanisms, to identify unique capabilities that the United States or other countries may have in this arena, whether it be technical expertise or different financing mechanisms or different geopolitical situations or existing relationships with other countries, as well as identifying guidelines for the development and use and investment in infrastructure projects abroad. It would be very driven by what countries want to be a part of this initiative. However, there already is quite positive examples where the United States has worked with countries like Australia and Japan to help fund an undersea cable in Asia Pacific, or organizing and collaborating around what it would mean to have quality infrastructure investment guidelines for the private sector and for other countries' government investments. And to answer your question about where would these projects take place, it could be that it's investment projects or digital development projects in countries that are not part of the coalition. But the Commission was not prescriptive as to exactly where the investments would be, simply noting that there is a great need for greater collaboration by like-minded countries to invest in these infrastructure projects because, quite frankly, digital development is only going to expand, and other countries are filling that gap right now.
On technical standards, it's a topic that's brought up a lot in the report. AI standardization is critical for interoperability, and China has increased its presence in these standard-setting bodies with an eye toward swaying them toward technology standards that it controls or that its manufacturers use. How would the emerging technology coalition's focus on standards address these concerns?
We see this as a topic that would be very ripe for discussion within this coalition. The Commission in this Chapter 15 has a series of recommendations that are focused on the U.S. government and trying to better organize the U.S. government to address international technical standards. And part of that is resourcing. It is making sure that you have enough funds for, number one, to have experts in standards at the agencies that are really relevant to particular standards on these sorts of technologies. And number two, making sure that you have funds so they can actually travel and attend meetings in other countries. And right now, there just isn't enough of either of those two things. So the Commission does call for that. And I'll get to the international piece in a moment. The Commission also calls for better coordination within the U.S. government. So the National Institute of Standards and Technology has a critical role. NIST has a critical role in developing standards and the U.S. government's position on standards before these international technical standards bodies. But there are other agencies that have critical roles as well. So we have called for an interagency task force that would include NIST as well as the Departments of State, Defense, Commerce, Homeland Security, and the Office of the Director of National Intelligence and USAID. Each of those agencies has a unique role in evaluating standards, and input from each of them is really important. So the Commission's recommendation is actually to have a dedicated person at each of those agencies to focus on international technical standards, for these people to come together in a task force, formulate the position of the U.S. government on different issues, and to engage in a more holistic manner with the private sector. In the U.S., the private sector has a very important role in advocating before standards bodies. But as they do that, it's important that they understand the U.S. government's unique positions on some of these issues. The private sector may not always be as well situated as the government to understand the national security implications of technical standards. And so that's why it's important that the U.S. government have a more coordinated position and a stronger voice when discussing these issues with agencies, and also with private sector, and being present when these discussions are actually occurring. As you noted, China is the preeminent example of a nation that is getting much more involved in standards bodies, and they are participating more. They have more leadership roles in a number of these organizations, and they're very active. And the United States has not been as active in this as they should be. The Commission has also called for the creation of a federal advisory committee that brings together experts from the private sector and academia to provide to the task force strategic guidance. And what we mean by that is not guidance on should the standard be A or should it be B or C, but rather guidance from their vantage point about what is in the strategic interest of the United States, so that as the experts within the US government are considering these issues, they're also taking into account a richer mix of analysis about the overall strategic import.
The challenge is that China is not so democratic in dealing with its quasi-private sector that are represented at these standards bodies. China sets a policy for voting and everyone falls in line, or if they don't, it's at their peril. And the U.S. can't really mandate positions for private sector voting and standards bodies, nor can they mandate positions for other countries, certainly. I'm wondering, would the technology coalition try and coordinate positions on standards to counter China? For example, the most pressing standards under discussion are those around 5G infrastructure. And China has been fairly successful in pushing some of its standards to allow Huawei to participate.
I'm glad that you reminded me of the international angle because, yes, the idea is that one of the features of this coalition is that it's important for nations to convene and to talk about these issues because there's not always a lot of coordination and people see things from their own vantage. And having a broader view of the world and understanding the implications of technical standards and how they play into bigger strategic issues is something that's really important. So the US government needs to coordinate better within itself. It needs to work better with industry and outside experts, and it also needs to work better with its allies and partners.
I wanted to address an earlier point about technical standardization efforts and why they're really important. So for everyone's awareness, international technical standards are extremely important for interoperable marketplace, ensuring consumer safety, basically ensuring that the product that you buy, you can trust that it's met certain requirements, that a paper that says it's A4 is actually A4, that a plug that's supposed to plug into a certain outlet can do so no matter where in the world you actually are. Just a laptop has over 250 standards. Although the Commission has noted, and you've brought up, Craig, concerning trends that are happening at some of these technical standards bodies, there is a real benefit for having all countries involved in the technical standard setting process. But there is that element where the United States and like-minded allies should be working to ensure that these technical standards remain neutral bodies for the benefit of not one country over the other, but for the benefit of humanity, for the benefit of consumers, and for innovation. In all of these recommendations that the Commission has made for the US government, the international element would be around information sharing. And although the Emerging Technology Coalition, we do recommend that they look at technical standards, there are other standards and norms that are taking place in not technical standards bodies. So there's going to be a benefit for having the Emerging Technology Coalition, for example, come up with best practices for data sharing that can be determined within the Emerging Technology Coalition sort of fluid group of countries, or also help align a position or come to agreement that another forum like the OECD might be the right place for reaching agreement on data sharing practices, for example. So standards and norms, it's quite a large bucket where there's the technical standards pieces and protecting the neutrality of, for example, 3GPP or ISO and IEC, but also trying to determine guidelines for operationalizing AI principles that enable responsible use of AI.
You said that the point of coordinating on technical standards is to ensure that they support free and open and safe technology for the world. But there is, for example, this standoff between the US and China over Huawei, and a lot of this technical standards issues are focused on giving Huawei or US companies an advantage in building infrastructure. So I'm saying that a cynic would say that it's less about creating safe standards for the world than it is about giving the U.S. or China an advantage.
So there is something normative here. And if you look at Huawei, one of the issues is ensuring security and trustworthiness and a degree of privacy preserving technology. And the commission is not shy about coming out in very strong support of democratic values and promoting those values as they're embedded in technology to make sure that technology is trustworthy, reliable, safe, and so on. The commission views those as positives and thinks that the United States needs to be active in promoting. And the end result of that may be that there's particular nations that generates technology that comports with those values and in other nations that don't. There is a values competition here. And one of the places in which this is playing out is in these standards bodies. Another feature of this is to ensure that the standard setting bodies remain neutral, that they really should be evaluating things on technical bases, guided by certain values, and that the US and its allies and partners shouldn't be ashamed of promoting those values. But we also want these bodies to be neutral and to really look at things that are going to be best for consumers around the world.
The commission is quite optimistic about the United States working with like-minded allies and partners to really marshal the global AI cooperation and cooperation on emerging technologies that we think is really critical to advance free and open societies and really address a lot of these challenges that we noted at the very beginning of our conversation. We've been overwhelmed by the positive response that we've heard and seen in the press from other countries and other countries' enthusiasm about working with the United States on some of these really critical areas. The European Parliament have invited commissioners to testify at a hearing. There have been op-eds written and proposals for a transatlantic AI agreement, for other discrete areas for the United States to work with other countries bilaterally and multilaterally on a lot of these issues.
You have a blueprint in the report attached to these recommendations. Some of the recommendations require legislative action. These do not. As you were saying earlier, it's really interagency actions that are required. How do you get this to happen?
When you're talking about the international space, and a lot of this stuff is within, if not almost all of this, except for some of the funding things, are really within the auspices of the executive branch. There are a number of very significant funding recommendations in Chapter 15 that call on significantly more resourcing for the Department of State, the U.S. Agency for International Development, the Development Finance Corporation, and some other agencies. Those would require congressional action. There are some discrete legislative proposals in here, for example, around technical standards that would benefit from congressional action. There's also a call for an international AI Research Institute in the United States, the Multilateral Artificial Intelligence Research Institute, which would require legislative action as well. Many of the others, though, as you pointed out, Craig, can be handled by the executive branch itself. It is actually quite interesting that there's just been a bill introduced in the Senate that would create an office within the State Department. And the focus of this office would be to develop an international partnership around emerging technologies that is very similar to the Emerging Technology Coalition that the Commission has proposed. So while that is something that could be done without congressional support other than appropriations, there is a legislative vehicle as well. So I think the Commission will be engaging to the extent possible with senior leaders across the executive branch as well as with Congress to try to discuss these recommendations and encourage their adoption. And I think the Commission will continue to engage with foreign governments and civil society and other actors to discuss these ideas and understand their perspectives and generate interest.
That's it for this week's podcast. I want to thank Paul and Christie for their time. I encourage everyone who cares about the future of our world to read the National Security Commission on AI report which can be found at www.nscai.gov. Regardless of how you feel about military uses of AI, I believe it's critical that people involved in the field understand what the government is doing. The singularity may not be near, but AI is changing your world, so pay attention.